Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, putting a bow on the Wolves' terrible loss to the Rockets on Monday night. There's a couple more takeaways we have to get to regarding that. Also, we're just a couple weeks away now from the NBA trade deadline. There's a couple more Timberwolves rumors out there. I want to cover those, especially including Naz Reid and some players the Wolves could be interested in a return potentially for Naz. And we'll close by previewing Wolves-Pelicans on Wednesday night. It's all coming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy Hump Day and happy Timberwolves game day. The Timberwolves are in New Orleans for the last game of this mini 2-game road trip to take on the Pelicans. We'll talk about that at the end of the show. A couple more things, also some trade deadline stuff to get to here off the top. So we'll do that here in a moment. First of all, though, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. More great local sports coverage 24/7, and it's absolutely free. Download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today at Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves. Don't forget the T, and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. All right. So as much as I don't want to spend that much more time dwelling on Wolves Rockets, there's a couple things, couple stats I saw after the fact that I want to call out. Also, I think, well, yeah, we'll start there. And then I do want to get to some trade stuff because I think, I don't know. I've talked a little bit about D'Angelo Russell. I haven't talked a lot about Naz Reid as a trade possibility. Those rumors have kind of cropped up more frequently here of late. So I want to cover that and again, kind of reiterate my prediction for the trade deadline for the Wolves. Okay. So Tuesday night, the Timberwolves lose to the Houston Rockets. Monday night, they lost to Houston Rockets, who had lost 13 in a row. They lost 18 of 19. And this was a game the Wolves never led by more than 6. This was all Rockets all game long. And it was pretty frustrating. I think in fact, I did the live postcast with Marnie for Valley Sports North. I did the Tuesday show where I did the postgame pod, went through everything, and I spent a long time in the second segment of the show. If you missed it, go back and listen to it. I'll give you a snippet of it now. Basically, my biggest takeaway from that game was how poor the Timberwolves perimeter defense was, and specifically Anthony Edwards, because I think as much as there's multiple things wrong with this team, and I don't want to misplace blame because, hey, I've talked a lot about D'Angelo Russell's issues, talked about Rudy Gobert's shortcomings this season. He just isn't the player he typically has been, and for whatever reason, and perhaps that changes, perhaps it doesn't, I don't know. But I think Ant is the place to start, because if Ant was going to make that John Morant-like leap, that leap needed to have started to happen this year. And we've seen flashes of it lately. The offense, of course, has been incredible. Even going back to Saturday against Houston, the game prior to the Monday loss to the Rockets, against that same Rockets team on Saturday, the defense was locked down. And I think coming into this season, there was so much conversation. I mean, Zach Lowe at ESPN talked on his podcast and his article about how Anthony Edwards could make some noise related to an all defensive team this year. Right. And if that's a legitimate thing. And I think given the expectations and given what the ceiling of Anthony Edwards is defensively, the fact that he was as bad as he was for long stretches of that game Monday, and that's not necessarily an isolated incident, right? This happens frequently with Ant. That's really, really disappointing. Now, to be clear, John Morant's not a very good defender, right? So I'm not comparing the two. That's not what this is. In this instance, I am, though, because I want to be clear. Ant is still a really good player, but he's still not as efficient offensively, hasn't done as much offensively as we've seen Ja do over the last couple of years. And he hasn't been, Ja's not a good defender. Ant can be a great defender, literally an all NBA caliber defender. So it's that much more frustrating. He has more tools defensively than Ja does. I think he's got really all of his defensive skills are better than Ja Morant's. And he just hasn't been able to make up that gap that still exists offensively because Ja is so dynamic at the rim and getting to the basket. And Ant is too. He just hasn't finished at a high enough clip at the basket. He's obviously a better shooter than Ja Morant, but like there's just a disconnect because the defense isn't consistent enough, but it should be because of what it could be. That makes it that much more frustrating. And so I did spend a lot of time talking about that on Tuesday's show. I think it bears repeating that is one of the primary issues of late for the Timberwolves. Defensively, they're up to 14th in defensive rating, according to Basketball Reference. And even after letting the league's worst shooting team in terms of field goal percentage, and I think 29th in terms of effective field goal percentage in the Rockets, allowing them to shoot 50% from the floor on Monday, the Wolves still have the number 14th ranked team defensively. And I maintain that this team has a defensive ceiling of, before the season, I said top 5. Now I think it comfortably should still be top 10 because you still have Rudy Gobert, you have Anthony Edwards, you have Jaden McDaniels. McDaniels and Edwards can both be elite on-ball defenders. And Rudy Gobert, even if he's not as game-changing as he has been over the past several years, he's still a plus-plus backline defender. And, of course, things have been thrown out of whack a little bit with the Towns injury and the Jordan McLaughlin injury, and now again Taurean Prince being hurt. But like Kyle Anderson is still a good defender. Like this team has enough good defensive pieces. The fact that there could be this many lapses on the perimeter, especially, but also in the front court, is pretty disconcerting to me. And while the offense has been a bigger issue throughout the season, if the defense was the top 10 defense that it should be, this team is probably a couple games above 500 instead of one below 500. So Ant is a huge reason for that because it hasn't been consistent enough. Jaden McDaniels' foul trouble is hurt at times. Actually, on Monday, it was Kyle Anderson's foul trouble that hurt. So there's a lot of things we can point to that are the primary issues. But I think the reason why Ant is so frustrated is because he wants to be an all-star. He wants to be all-NBA. I have a really tough time campaigning for that when he lets Eric Gordon score on straight line drives multiple possessions in a row. I'm sorry. I love Ant. I hope I'm wrong. I hope he makes the all-star team. I'm not going to sit here and campaign for him, though, if that's what we're getting on the defensive end of the floor. And the consistency on offense isn't, frankly, there either, although it's obviously much better on the offensive end. So, and I want to be really, really clear. I say this because, again, the ceiling is Ant could be literally one of the top couple 2 or 3 offensive, defensive, two-way players in the entire NBA this season. If he plays like he did Saturday and a handful of other times this year and just puts it all together, all he has to do is just decide to do it. Like he's that good. So it's frustrating when he turns in performances like Monday. And again, many Timberwolves, basically every Timberwolf was culpable for Monday's loss. He's not the only one. But sometimes if you're the best player and you're expected to be a great player, not just the best player on a mediocre team, the expectations are higher. And I don't want to lose sight of that in the middle of this kind of really frustrating Timberwolves season. A couple other quick things for Monday. This is actually Alan Horton, the Timberwolves radio voice, tweeted a couple of these things out, and I thought they were both, interesting in a bad way, funny and not a ha-ha way, but, want to repeat him. Alan Horton, of course, the voice of the Wolves radio on Twitter, actually the former host of this podcast, Locked On Wolves, a few years ago. Alan said the Timberwolves were down 199 with 5 minutes left against the Rockets, down by 1 with 5 minutes to play. Over the next 4 minutes, they missed all 9 of their shots and had a turnover when Houston went on a 9-1 run. It was then an 8-point game with about a minute left. And yeah, the Wolves got it to 4 a couple of times. So, it wasn't as obvious of a stat because they didn't finish the game in that drought, but that's when the game was decided. It was from 5 minutes left to about 1 minute left. The Timberwolves went 0 of 9 from the field with the turnover. And that's also when Jalen Green went off and did his thing. So I wanted to point that out. The other thing is, this is more of a season-long observation, and I've talked about this. Marnie and I have talked about it on the postcast. The Wolves have now lost, of course, to Detroit twice. They've lost to Houston once. Those are the 2 best teams in the league, no question. They also lost to Charlotte, who's played a little better lately, but is still not good. And twice to the Spurs. Remember, we played the Spurs. The Wolves played the Spurs a bunch early this season. Minnesota lost twice to them. And, I mean, those are the 4 worst teams in the league, right? Spurs, Pistons, Rockets, Hornets. They've now lost 6 times to the 4 worst teams in the league. Both times they see Detroit. I think they've only played Charlotte once. I can't remember exactly. I guess we're done with Houston now too. So not a whole lot of opportunities left And that's one of the reasons why the second half is so brutal. I talked about this when I did the midseason kind of review / preview of the second half of the year a couple weeks ago. We'll also have a tough schedule remaining. They've already played a lot of the worst teams in the league. And the next week is like a murderer's row. Pelicans, Kings a couple of times. Memphis is in there a couple of times the next few weeks. Like the next week is really tough. The rest of the season is tough schedule wise for Minnesota. So they've already kind of kicked away some of those easier games on the schedule. All right. Next, I want to talk trade deadline. I want to talk Naz Reid specifically. So we're going to get into all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our presenting sponsors, our new friends over at FanDuel. The NFL playoffs are here. We're really excited about our new sports betting partner for Locked On because they are the #1 sportsbook in America, FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. New customers can join today to get started with $150 in free bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. $5 bet to get $150 in free bets. Just sign up at FanDuel.com/locked on. FanDuel has all your favorite bets from the money line to point spreads to player props. Plus, you can even combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with the same game parlay. I said I was going to look at Wolves-Pelicans line for this show, and I forgot to do it, but I'm betting it's probably 2.5 Pels. Rudy Gobert is questionable for the game. Pelicans, of course, have a bunch of injuries. We'll get to that later, but I'm betting that the Pelicans are a slight favorite, probably 2 points. It's all in an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So football fans, don't miss out. Place your first $5 bet to get $150 in free bets. Win or lose at FanDuel.com/locked on. I say football fans because, of course, FanDuel is the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Make every moment more with FanDuel. Again, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL, FanDuel.com/locked on. All right. The Naz Reid rumors. So it's been out there a little bit. I've talked a bit on this show about how he was a potential. I thought the Wolves would trade him in the offseason. I was wrong, obviously. I thought they could get a couple second rounders for him because he was going to be a free agent after this year. The Wolves, of course, having acquired Gobert and having Nate Knight, having re-signed Nate Knight, I was like, I don't know why you need Naz. I think Naz has some of the same, and this is still true. Some of his weaknesses generally over the course of his career line up unfavorably with some of the Wolves' weaknesses, like namely defensive rebounding, right? Naz has not been a very good defensive rebounder as a center over the course of his career. Now, this has been the best rebounding season of his career pretty easily. So he's obviously improved in that area. He's actually got a better rebound rate than both Luka Garza and Nate Knight, which I would not have expected. He's second on the team to Rudy Gobert. Like he's actually got a better rebound rate than Towns did when he was playing the season. So Naz has proved me wrong in that regard, and he's also played just generally very well this season. So I want to say that it's probably a good thing they didn't trade him for a couple second rounders in the offseason because given the injuries to the center position, obviously mostly Towns, but now also Rudy missing a handful of games, it's been nice having that depth. So I'm willing to say that it would have probably been a mistake if I guess it would have been slightly low on Naz because he's played so well this year. Now the talk is, could they trade him for actual NBA talent? And that's the conversation because again, he is an expiring contract, a small one, but he's a free agent at the end of the season. The Wolves have reportedly had extension talks. There were a couple of reports out there they'd offered him. I forget who the source was initially, but it was like 4 years, 50 some million. So apologies to whoever reported that because I don't have it in front of me. Which is, I think more than he's going to get on the market, on the open market. I think it's likely he's going to be, well, actually, so this is from Michael Scotto at Hoops Hype. He says Reid could potentially command an average annual salary around the full taxpayer, non-taxpayer mid-level exception. So a little bit less than what reportedly the Timberwolves have tried to offer him extension-wise. I think that extension would be kind of a lot to pay somebody who is a backup center, and you've got two of the best four centers in the league in Towns and Gobert. Now, of course, this year it would be that valuable because they've needed Naz Reid, but you can't, like, what's the ceiling on Naz minutes? Like how much was he playing at the start of the season? He had a couple DNP CDs. He had a few 8-10 minute performances. So I just have a tough time paying him what it sounds like he thinks he wants to get paid. And I get it from Naz's perspective. He wants to cash in and he should. But from the Wolves' perspective, I think extending Naz, I think you're going to overpay. I think it's going to be a really tough thing to do. So I would look to trade him. Now, I'm not saying I for sure would. It obviously depends on what you get back, right? And I think it's clear, like, maybe we don't say this enough. saying that you should be open to trading somebody is not the same as saying like, hey, trade him for a bag of balls, right? Like, I mean, the Wolves would have to get something back in return. That's a value for a player who is valuable in Naz Reid. Even if he's going to walk at the end of the season, like this is still right now a play-in team that should be a playoff team that should improve. We're waiting for it, but it should improve as the season wears on. And Naz Reid's a big part of the rotation right now with Towns out. If Towns doesn't return before the trade deadline, which seems pretty likely, we're just 2 weeks out and Towns isn't practicing yet. I mean, you need Naz Reid. Like if Towns were back and healthy, then I think trading Naz would make a ton of sense. But since he's not, I don't know that that's a realistic possibility. There's been a couple different reports. There was one by, actually, I think this was first from the Kevin O'Connor at the Ringer that the Brooklyn Nets have called on, actually, this is the newest report. The Nets have called on Naz Reid. Now, that's all he really said. Like, what team hasn't called on every player, basically? That's an exaggeration. But basically, like, if there's a player you're at all interested in, of course you're going to call and check on the availability. So I don't know there's much to see there related to the Nets. Michael Scotto of HoopsHype, who had reported that he believes Reid could get the mid-level exception this offseason, either full or mid-level exception. Full taxpayer or non-taxpayer mid-level. He reports that the Clippers and Nuggets have interest in Naz Reid. Of course, both teams in similar position. Well, the Nuggets are much better, but all three should be playoff teams in the West. All three are teams that thought they'd be top 4 or 5 seeds in the West this season. And frankly, it seems like the Nuggets are the only one that will be. What's of interest? What are the Nuggets giving up? What are the Clippers giving up to get Naz Reid? So Scotto wonders aloud and he doesn't say that this is like what the Wolves are asking for. He just says, could the Clippers entice? Could the Nuggets entice? So he says, could the Nuggets trade the Wolves Bones Highland, whom Tim Connolly, of course, drafted in Denver just a couple of years ago? And I don't know, like, depends on what you think about the Wolves point guard situation. Like if you end up trading D'Angelo Russell, then could Bones Highland be part of that? Could you trade D'Angelo Russell and Naz Reid? And actually, Scotto does mention D'Lo. Could D'Angelo Russell and I don't know that the Nuggets would actually have interest in D'Angelo Russell, but could you trade D'Lo and Naz in a deal and get back Bones Highland? Would that be like, what kind of fit is that? I mean, like Bones is only in his second season, and so he's going to have you've got a couple more years before you've got to extend him. And so D'Lo is a free agent this summer. You avoid just losing that cap hold when D'Lo becomes a free agent, right? Because you don't just get that full slot when D'Lo walks in free agency. If and when it's 30 plus million, it just basically goes away. So in this case, you'd be trading D'Lo and you'd be taking back. Now, obviously, there's some salary stuff that would need to happen there. To be very clear, I'm not like sitting here running this through the trade. Like, I get it. You can't just trade D'Lo and take back Bones Highland. That's not how this works. But if you're able to make some salaries match, take back a couple expirings, whatever it is, it's probably a multi-team deal, which we know Tim Connolly does a bunch of those, right? The Wolves were in a couple of them when Connolly was in Denver. And all that to say, in terms of the fit of Bones Highland to Minnesota, I think it works okay. I think that you'd like somebody to be a little bit more consistent of a defender if you're replacing D'Lo, and Bones isn't quite the shot creator for himself that D'Angelo Russell is. Like, he's fine and he can score. He's kind of a spot up 3-point shooter that you'd like to. I mean, he's been a little better this year, about 39%, but he doesn't score all that efficiently off the dribble, and he's an inconsistent defender. So I like him as a rotational guard. I like him as a player overall. I don't know that trading Naz Reid and D'Angelo Russell and bringing back Bones Highland does much for you other than you find a point guard that can function with your team for the next couple of years. A little bit of a lower usage guy, which I think there's some value in that, but he's been a pretty high usage guy this year in Denver. Obviously mostly off their bench, but like that's been his role, has been kind of an off the bench scorer in Denver. Is he going to be a starting guard? Will the Wolves trust him to be a starting guard moving forward into the next 2 to 3 years, most likely alongside Rudy Gobert and Karl-Anthony Towns? I don't know. I mean, I think you'd have to recoup some picks or something in a deal like that. And is Denver going to give up picks to get D'Angelo Russell? I actually think D'Lo's not a terrible fit in Denver. They're bad enough defensively often anyway that D'Lo could actually fit their offense pretty well. I think that would be interesting. It'd be somewhat of a weird thing for D'Lo to go to a divisional opponent midseason. I'd be surprised if that's what happened. I think it's more likely a multi-team trade where D'Lo goes somewhere else and Bones Highland could come to Minnesota and perhaps Naz then goes to Denver or something like that is feasible. The other thing that's mentioned is Terrence Mann and the LA Clippers as a possibility. like, I like that one a little bit more. I think it's a little more realistic, partly because they're not in the same division, and so I think those things, the wheels get greased a little bit easier there. Also, the interesting thing with Terrence Mann, though, is from a contract perspective. See if I can. He actually just signed the extension that kicks in next year, so he's got a couple years left on the deal that are fully. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the extension was already, or the option was already exercised. So he's got 10.5 million on the books next year and 11.4 the following year. I don't know what the Clippers' motivation to do a deal like that. And again, I'm saying these names because Michael Scott of Hoops Hype said them. I like Terrence Mann. I like that fit. They need a hard nosed defender, somebody who, can be lower, is a lower usage player, can knock down an open three. He's a career 37% 3-point shooter, but is kind of a defender first and does everything well, essentially, right? Not a guy who's he's not the scorer that D'Lo is. He's maybe not the I mean, he's not. There's certain things about Bones' Highland game, certainly a little bit more upside there. I think more of a high volume type scorer off the bench. Terrence Mann's more of just like a steady guy. Like he can play the wing, can do a couple different things, can initiate a little bit of offense, but a good wing defender. Like you can never have enough of those. I spent the first segment talking about how bad the Wolves wing defense has been. The fit of Terrence Mann to me is intriguing. I just don't know what's in it for the Clippers to make that deal. Why would they need another high usage guy like a D'Angelo Russell? I mean, if they have interest in Naz Reid, sure, let's have that conversation. But then how do the Wolves how does that work? They don't have first round picks to trade. How are you getting Terrence Mann for Naz Reid? Maybe D'Lo goes somewhere else and someone else sends picks to the Clippers, but then why are the Clippers really wanting to trade Terrence Mann and bring back Naz Reid? So the whole thing to me doesn't make a ton of sense. So all that to say, going back to what I have said previously on the show, I don't think the Wolves make a deal at the deadline. I think they stand pat. I don't think they're able to get anything done. They don't have first round picks to trade. They don't have a ton of salary that teams are interested in. Naz Reid and Jalen Noel will draw some interest, but both of them are on bargain contracts anyway. So you can't really take back salary. And unless the Wolves decide like, hey, let's move on from Jalen Noel and give those minutes to a defender like a Wendell Moore, that's feasible. And maybe you get a second rounder for Jalen Noel. But his value is only going down versus where it was in November. So that to me is maybe the most likely trade would be Noel for, a different expiring contract, maybe a veteran, or maybe it's a second round pick. And then you sign Pat Bev when he's bought out. That's possible. I don't think the Wolves do anything significant. I think it'd be really difficult for that to happen. I think it's unlikely D'Lo's traded. I think it's maybe a little more likely Naz Reid's traded, but I don't think he will be. So my prediction is no trade. If a trade happens, it's Jalen Noel and it's something minor, and perhaps Patrick Beverley gets added on the buyout market. All right, let's close the show today by looking at the Wolves-Pelicans matchup on Wednesday night. All right, Wolves-Pelicans Wednesday night. The last time the Timberwolves saw the Pelicans was December 28th, between Christmas and New Year's. That was Minnesota went to New Orleans, took them down to the wire, and it was disappointing in that the Wolves were actually winning for much of this game. They were up 6 at halftime. They were up 2 going to the fourth quarter, and Zion Williamson just went off down the stretch. Remember, this was the game where D'Lo made the comment after about how Zion's playing football and everybody else is playing it. He's playing a different sport, basically. And there's a lot of different ways you could interpret that quote, but no matter what, Zion Williamson went nuts at the end of this game, had 43 points, 19 free throw attempts, by the way, in this game. The Timberwolves as a team had 32, and the Timberwolves had 2 players with 9 free throws, nobody else with more than 3. The Pelicans, 19 free throws from Zion, 43 as a team. Zion scored 43 and 21 points, was dominant, had that huge steal at the end, ran right through Jaden McDaniels, grabbed the steal, got the breakaway dunk. The Pelicans ended up winning by 1. The Wolves messed up that last ATO, that last out of bounds play, and couldn't get a shot off at the end of the game. So this was a disappointing loss, yet still they went toe to toe with the team that at the time was 10 games above 500 or was 10 games above 500 after the game. The Wolves were in a bit of a swoon. They were at this point 3 games under 500, but they went toe to toe with the Pels. And that was significant. And it was, obviously no Brandon Ingram. I should reiterate that. There was no Brandon Ingram in this game, but McCollum played, Zion Williamson played. Now, since then, Zion Williamson actually got hurt about a week after that and hasn't played. I think it was a hamstring. He was supposed to be reevaluated right around now. Like we're getting close to when Zion's going to play, but I don't think there's any chance he plays Wednesday. Brandon Ingram, though, hasn't played in like 6 weeks or something like that. And he was actually listed as doubtful for their game Tuesday against Denver. As I'm recording this, they're actually playing the Nuggets. I'm recording Tuesday night, so I don't know the outcome of that game yet. But it wouldn't shock me if Brandon Ingram suited up against the Wolves. Like, he's getting close to returning, and it'd be the second night of a back-to-back. There's going to be some guys that are tired, et cetera. So perhaps there's a chance Ingram, assuming he didn't play Tuesday night against the Nuggets, there's a chance he plays Wednesday. But no Zion Williamson, almost certainly, likely no Brandon Ingram. And CJ McCollum is kind of this team's offense at this point. Again, I don't know what's happening in the Tuesday night game. Well, I'll tell you what's happening now as I'm recording it. The game literally just started. So we don't know how Pelicans Nuggets is going to turn out. But prior to that, the Pelicans had lost 4 consecutive games. They've really struggled without Zion Williamson. And they're now 26-21 coming into play on Tuesday. And obviously still very good. Still a difficult place to play on the road is New Orleans. But it looks a lot more winnable with no Zion Williamson and potentially still no Brandon Ingram. Against Miami, the timeout before that on Sunday, the Pelicans got 14 and 16 from Jonas Valanciunas, who obviously always gives the Wolves trouble. McCollum struggled a bit. He's like, it's tough to operate your entire offense around him, as Portland found out in the times Damian Lillard was hurt. McCollum's a really nice scorer, but especially at this stage in his career, it's just not realistic to really build your offense around him. And so the Pelicans have struggled offensively, and they've had a lot of turnovers. They had 24 turnovers in their loss to Miami the other night. They got up in that game. They scored 32 in the first quarter and had a double-digit lead early in the second, but then offensively struggled the rest of the way, failed to get to 100 points. And I don't know where their offense is really going to come from. They were 8 of 30 against the Heat from 3. You look at their roster overall this season, like, again, this is overall. So this includes, 15 games of Brandon Ingram and 30 games of Zion Williamson, 29 games of Williamson. They're 14th in 3-point percentage, but they're only 26th in 3-point rate. They do get to the line quite a bit, and they're a decent, kind of average free throw shooting team, excuse me. They're also a good offensive rebounding team. Now, Zion's a big part of that. So no Zion Williamson changes that a bit, but Valanciunas makes a ton of noise on the glass. Larry Nance does off the bench for them, and he always seems to give the Wolves problems too. A player the Wolves have been interested in at multiple times in the past. So that, to me, is one of the keys, is defensive rebounding. Even with no Zion, you got to deal with Valanciunas. You got to deal with Nance. That's something I'd be worried about in this game for Minnesota. Also, turnovers. The Pelicans force a lot of turnovers. They're defensively, they're 6th in the league, and they are overall defensively, and they're 5th in turnover rate coming into play on Tuesday. So Minnesota's had these kind of fits and starts with turning the ball over. They've actually been better lately. Like, they only had 11 against Houston on Saturday. For the most part, they were better on Monday, even though they played badly in a lot of other areas. But the Pelicans like to turn teams over. The Wolves turn the ball over, have had these games where they've turned it over a bunch. So I'd be a little worried about that as well. Then the other thing is CJ McCollum. Like, whoever's going to guard him, if it's McDaniels, if it's Edwards, what I would do if I'm Chris Finch, I'd tell Anthony Edwards, go guard CJ McCollum. Don't let him score. And that's focus on that. Going back to what I said in the first segment on this show, I think that's a matchup that Ant should win. Ant's bigger than him. Jaden McDaniels can float, have him do whatever. Like, there's other guys. Again, the offense is CJ McCollum. Like, you're not too worried about anyone else. And of course I say that. And now, like, Devontae Graham's probably going to make 7 threes against the Wolves, because why wouldn't he? But that's what I would do. Have McDaniels guard Herb Jones and try and not get him into foul trouble. I think Ant has a better shot of guarding McCollum and not getting into foul trouble than Jaden McDaniels. So that's what I would do. See what happens. It's an interesting matchup, but defensive rebounding, don't turn the ball over against this team, because they're going to try and hunt steals, and lock down CJ McCollum, whatever you got to do. Lock down CJ McCollum. Injury report, still no Taurean Prince. He's going to be out with the sprained ankle again. And according to the team on Tuesday, Rudy Gobert is questionable. Of course, he played on Monday in Houston, so it seems like there's a probably good chance he plays on Wednesday. And of course, no McLaughlin, no Karl-Anthony Towns as well also. And then for the Pelicans, we don't know yet. Probably questionable on Ingram, likely out for Zion Williamson, and that's pretty much it in terms of guys that have been around for much of the season for them. So we'll see what happens on Wednesday. We'll, of course, go live with the postcast with Marnie on Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube. About 45 minutes following the game Wednesday night. We'll also do the post-game podcast, the live shows on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel. We also post the audio to the Locked On Wolves audio feeds after the fact. And then Thursday morning, you'll get the post-game podcast here on this feed, Locked On Wolves, wherever you listen to podcasts, and on YouTube at Locked On Wolves. A big thank you to those of you that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen each and every day. Of course, like I said, you can watch on YouTube or listen anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can also download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app for free on Roku or Amazon Fire TV and watch on there. You can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CK. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on the biggest stories. Now make your second listen today, the Game to Game NBA podcast. Every moment, every top performance, and every result from the night before. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.